Our first subdivision of narrative is story. Since film narrative tradition follows the traditions of literature and theater, some of the medium story tropes apply to film. This isn't always the case, but generally speaking, most examples of film stories follow a three-act structure where the first act includes exposition, in which the audience is introduced to characters, the world in which the story takes place, and the language of the film, or important things that we need to know in order to understand the actions of the characters. Racial tensions between elves and dwarves in Lord of the Rings, for example, explain why Gimli and Legolas are critical of each other in the early films and why their relationship towards the end is more endearing. This is the language of the Lord of the Rings. The second act of our generic story, after exposition, we are presented with the rising action of the film, where the central conflict is introduced and our characters leave home or wherever to begin their journey, also called a hero's journey. If the story is operating under the norms of a common Western monomyth, rising action can be defined as plot movement. These build up to the protagonist's epiphany at the beginning of the story's climax. And finally, the third act, beginning with our climax, includes the falling action in denouement. Keep in mind, a climax is not the same as a conclusion. A climax is more like the point of no return, where the only direction towards the conclusion is forward. In something like The Joker, the point where Arthur Fleck shoots the Trump Jr. look-alike on the subway train. At that point, violence has become the solution to Fleck's central conflict, and the world in which he inhabits is fractured as Gotham's masses romanticize the clown on the train. There's no returning home at that point. Another example in The Godfather, Michael murders McCluskey in Solozza in the Italian restaurant. At that point, all of his efforts to stay outside the family's business have failed, and he's in it, whether he wants to be or not. The remainder of the movie, until he slams the door in Annie Hall's face, is just the process of destabilization, until he's just as culpable as his father, Don Corleone. Remember this example for later. In our next section on discourse, we will look at a specific example how this destabilization is illustrated on screen. That destabilization in The Godfather is what we call the falling action. The remainder of the story progresses until our hero returns home irreversibly changed. Unless it's a Coen Brothers movie like The Big Lebowski, Burn After Reading, or No Country for Old Men, where the main characters return having learned nothing or doesn't make it home at all, and the world is completely unchanged by the events of the story. Finally, most stories, not all, you have the final segment of the third act, the denouement, or a really hard word that just means the wrap-up. In The Lord of the Rings, the denouement is Frodo, Bilbo, and the elves leaving Middle-earth for the Grey Havens. In Sherlock Jr., you could argue the central conflict is solved when his fiancée finds the missing pocket watch, and the remainder of the film is some form of a denouement. Again, not every three-act story is going to include a wrap-up. Neither Zodiac or No Country for Old Men have a wrap-up. Instead, we can assume that those segments of a story have concluded, but Anton Chigrin in No Country for Old Men is still out there looking for the money, and the Zodiac killer is never apprehended or even really identified. Throughout this section, I've referenced something called the hero's journey a few times. This is just a specific type of monomyth as defined by Joseph Campbell in his 1949 book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and comes up a lot in the study of narrative. Campbell and others theorize that all of the stories told by any given vernacular share a unified monomyth. The hero's journey is just the European version of this. It's a bit reductive, but does mesh well with both a three-act story structure and how we are traditionally taught to write an argumentative essay. In the hero's journey, there are three main segments: the hero's departure, initiation, and return, call to action, point of change, and the return home. In essay writing, for example, you begin with an expository introduction where you introduce the topic, points of support, and the thesis. Then there is the body where the support is applied to your thesis to confirm your argument, and finally a conclusion where you return to the introduction, but recraft it in context with your expanded points of support. So three-part cycle where the thesis returns irreversibly confirmed by the supporting evidence.